Just on Sunday, a few days ago, we experienced some rains and its accompanying floodings. We want to understand the situation and where we stand because, like I've mentioned on the show, we are yet to get to the peak of the rainy season. And so, where do we stand? How prepared are we? How do we mitigate the impact? Okay, if nature decides to take its toll on us, it will be difficult for us to survive. But as human as we are, we need to put in measures to mitigate the impact of nature when it begins to bite. Okay, so we're going to go into a conversation. This morning I have with me Richard Amoyate. He's the Director of Inspectorate for the National Disaster Management Organization. Good morning, sir.
Good morning.
Good to have you. Good to have you.
Yeah, it's good for me to be here.
Right, you must have been busy in the past few days.
Very busy over the last few days.
How hectic has it been?
Very hectic, day and night. You know, we had sleepless nights on the Sunday,
Wow.
and then a Monday, and following from that, it's assessing the conditions all over.
Yeah.
So it's been hectic.
The calls have been coming through.
Serious calls.
Wow.
Serious
All right, so let's look at NADMO. Let's give a broad overview of NADMO. What are some of the common disasters that you have to deal with, and how do you prepare for these?
You know, NADMO itself, let me give a brief history.
Right.
Was established by Act 517 in 1996 to manage disasters and similar emergencies. When you talk about similar emergencies, you are looking at some incidents that are in themselves not hazardous, but if not managed well, could be hazardous and lead to disruption of the functioning of society. An example is issues of migration.
Right.
So we manage some of these things under similar emergencies. But in 2015, there was a review of the Act 517 and the general operations of disaster management in the country. And some weaknesses were identified. And the key was that there was no participatory approach to disaster management. Everything rested on the agency. The citizens didn't have a role to play. And disaster management is everybody's business. So Act 927 was passed to correct some of the weaknesses. Yeah. So one of the things in the Act 927, the object was expanded to include and to develop the capacity of communities to respond effectively to disasters and emergencies. So communities now have a responsibility to participate in disaster management because whatever happens first in a community, and every community should be the first line of response. They should be able to start something to help themselves before help comes from elsewhere. So that is why we have the disaster volunteers in communities who are the first line of response because they live in the communities and then they can then reach out to us for professional help and support.
Right. I've sat in conversations where the issue of our approach and our mindset to some of these things have come up. And one question that occasionally pops up is the issue of prevention against management and why we don't have a national disaster prevention organization, but we have a management organization.
You know, when you talk about disaster management, there are phases. We look at the prevention and mitigation phase, then the preparedness phase, the response, and then the recovery and reconstruction.
Right.
So there is prevention in the management. What is happening is, you see, there are two sides to this. We have the hazard, and then we have the disaster. The hazard is any event or situation that can cause harm. Is the hazard.
Right.
And then the disaster is the harm it causes, how it disrupts the functioning of society. And then requires external support. That is a disaster. But then there are technical agencies responsible for managing each and every hazard that we have identified in this country. For example, if we talk about floods, which is a hazard, we have the Ghana Hydrological Authority. When you talk about diseases, we have the Ghana Health Service. When you look at geological incidents like earthquakes, we have the Ghana Geological Survey Authority.
Right.
But then ours is to manage disasters. So these agencies put in the control measures.
Right.
And then when they are overwhelmed and then it calls for a multi-sectorial, multidisciplinary response, then NADMO has the mandate and authority to coordinate and bring on board everybody to ensure that the situation is managed effectively. And then we also, in terms of preparedness, we ensure preparedness so that when it happens, we will be able to respond appropriately.
In coordinating these efforts, I want to zero in on the local communities. How do you bring them on board to build resilience and also promote disaster risk reduction?
We do this, like I've already said, that we have volunteers in communities who are our first line of response, because whatever happens starts from the community. So we have them in the communities. We have zonal offices across all the countries who liaise directly with these disaster volunteers. We have community information centers for early warning. That is alerting communities of impending situations so that they can best prepare. Because if you know, you can then prepare. It's better than being hit by a situation, being taken unawares. So that is how we relate to the community. We have offices right in the communities. And then we also develop capacity. I mentioned that in our objects, the object of the organization, we develop capacity for communities to respond effectively. And by so doing, we develop what we call contingency plans that give the communities responsibilities. And then we exercise by way of simulation, even before the incidents happen, in preparing the communities. We simulate the situations so that when it happens, they know how best to approach it.
Let's localize and personalize the conversation. Okay, so for individuals and for families, talk to us about some simple steps that can be taken in the instance of a disaster, say flood, fire, earthquake. What can individuals and families do?
What is it? Every individual, when you are to live in a new area, one thing you must do is to first try and identify the things around you that can harm you. You must be able to identify the things around you that can harm you.
Okay.
And then consult. If you don't have ideas as to how to manage those things that can harm you, then you consult the professionals. For example, when you go to an area, try and identify the nearest NADMO office. And then when you visit the nearest NADMO office, we can give you a hazard profile of the community and then tell you some of the things that you need to do to mitigate any occurrence. So this is some of the things, advices that we'll give to individuals, and especially people who want to buy land. People just buy land anywhere and then they start developing. Even before you buy a land, try and get to NADMO. Let's give you the profile of the area. Then with that profile, you can then go to your architect who design, and then your engineers will build and construct so that you can be resilient to whatever hazard you have in the community. But people just buy land, people just start developing without understanding the conditions around them. So these are the things that...
Well, let's zero in now on the issue that we're dealing with. I mean, we've dealt with fire from the beginning of the year. It's like nature is finding a way to punish us for our own activities, which have resulted in favorable conditions for some of the things we're suffering now. Fires from the beginning of the year. Now we're almost midway through the year, and we're experiencing the floods. Just Sunday, we experienced one, especially in the Greater Accra region. What is our current situation regarding flooding?
You know, like I said, that flood mitigation, one of the basic things is the drains. We need to expand our drains so that they can hold enough water. We need to have retention areas so that some of these floods will settle and then find their way slowly, flow slowly into the bigger drains. But the problem we have is that these days, you know, let me talk specifically about the 18th situation. According to the Ghana Meteorological Agency, it was only 25 millimeters of rain that we had on that day. But a day or two before that, we've had some rains. And so it was already a saturated system. And then again, there was a downpour on the Encroachment range, and then looking at the way we are developing on the mountain, where all the vegetation is giving way to concrete structures. That means that more runoffs from that area downhill. And then downhill, people are developing without drainage, appropriate drainage systems to carry these waters. That is why that part of Greater Accra was heavily flooded on that day. But then, like, our teams were on hand to rescue and save people from the effects of the floods.
Right. So we know that you've mentioned exactly the issue of drainage in the system. The capacity of drains now, and if you look at the topography of Accra, which is generally a low-lying area, what are the real dangers? I'm asking this vis-a-vis the rate of development we are seeing, especially on the Ebri Mountain.
Like I've said, anytime we develop concrete structures, we reduce infiltration and increase runoffs. So there must be accompanying drainage.
Okay.
There must, and then some of the existing drains are also choked through human activity.
Right.
Others are sedimentation, which needs redredging time and time. Like I said, there are agencies who have that clear responsibility.
Yeah.
Currently, we have the Garrett project, which is ongoing. That is a project to mitigate flooding in the Odo Basin. And it is not completed. And we believe that once that project is completed, a lot of these things will be mitigated.
Right. How worrying or troubling is the issue of encroachment? Say for a place like Wager, we know there's supposed to be an estuary there. People are building there. Nanakrum area coming down, there's supposed to be a dam somewhere. People are encroaching there. Even at Shaiman, there's supposed to be a dam there. There's encroachment. Ramsar sites, we are seeing encroachment. So how worrying or troubling is this?
Yeah, it's worrying because those are the areas for the water to settle. And then, so once, what people forget is that you take over the place meant for water, but they forget about the source.
Okay.
The water flowed to that area flows from somewhere to that area. So if you take over that area and the source is still there, then it will find its own way and create problems. So once you are developing in an area like that, then there should be appropriate mechanisms in place to channel the water. You know, thank God we have engineering solutions, but most of these developments don't have professionals on board to bring out the solutions. People have money and they start building without the involvement of architects and engineers. I think the most of that, the concentration is the cost. So we need to involve professionals as much as possible in our developmental process, because they will guide you, do the appropriate designs and guide you on the construction to ensure that these hazards are mitigated.
So who takes the blame then? The local authorities, because they give the building permits, they're supposed to have inspectorate divisions and all that, or is it the developer who has his money and things that he can develop anywhere? Who should take the blame for all this?
See, I have said that there are agencies responsible for managing the hazards. Obviously, I do not know their challenges, the challenges that they have. Yeah, but I think that everybody is doing their best with the resources available to them. Yeah, and then, you know, we are always waiting for enforcement. We advise that we should comply, because every act of compliance is disaster risk reduction. For example, if you comply with the National Building Regulations, you are reducing the risk of your building collapsing, your building being flooded. So it's disaster risk reduction. If you comply with fire regulations, you are reducing the risk of fires in your home. If you comply with building regulations, you are reducing the risk of your building collapsing under earthquake. So our advice is that there should be compliance by the citizens in our development. Everybody is talking about enforcement because people don't want to comply. But if everybody is complying, if everybody understands is that it is in their own interest to comply, we wouldn't be talking about enforcement and blaming agencies. So as citizens, let's comply to save ourselves. That is very, very important, and always waiting for people to enforce, people to force us to do the right thing. Let us understand that doing the right thing is in our own interest, and then comply with all the regulations regarding our development, and we will have a safer place.
So, I mean, I get that you're preaching compliance as against enforcement. But then, of course, we know that as human as we are, there are people who have the tendency to be non-compliant. In the absence of compliance, enforcement must be.
But then if the non-compliance overwhelms the enforcement, look at the rate of non-compliance. It will definitely overwhelm enforcement. People know that the institutions don't work on weekends. So people deliberately develop over the weekend, build over the weekend. You go to a place on a Friday, there's nothing. You go back on Monday, you'll be surprised.
So that's where the challenge is.
So we need more of compliance. People must know that it is in their own interest to comply. You know, when people, even those who in some way comply by going to the assemblies for permits, once they pay the application fees, they think it's okay, they are done. Because they always believe that government is always only finding a way to take money from them. They don't really understand that it is in their own interest to comply. So we need to preach more of compliance. The institutions have a mandate to enforce. Yes, they are doing the best. But let's save ourselves through compliance.
Very well. Let's look at your work practically. Run us through a typical response routine when a call is placed to NADMO, or maybe on your own assessment and monitoring, you come to the conclusion that there's a problem, a disaster happening somewhere, say the floods we witness. Run us through a typical routine process.
We have what we call the Emergency Operations Center,
Right.
which has two activation modes, the partial and active. In the partial mode, that is where nothing is happening. And then we are just monitoring the hazards. And then receiving calls from community. That's why we put up hotlines. You call 112, and if the issue has to do with disaster management, it will come to NADMO. Or you can call NADMO direct on 0299 350 030, and then
0299
350 030.
Right.
And then it will come to the EOC in a partial activation mode. And then if it has to be relayed to another agency, it will be done. But when the situation develops, escalates to a certain level, and then we have to fully activate, in the full activation mode, we bring all our stakeholders into one, on one table to focus on the response, where we need a multi-agency, multidisciplinary response. Then we do the full activation mode, where we bring all the agencies on board. So the EOC first receives the information and then shares it on the common platform with all our response agencies. And then the appropriate agency who has to take action will first move in. If it is rescue, we have the NADMO rescue team, we have the Ghana National Service, we have the Ghana Armed Forces, and then always on standby is the National Ambulance Service and then the Ghana Health Service.
Right.
So when there are casualties, then the ambulance will evacuate them to the hospitals. So it's a team work led by NADMO as the coordinator and then the lead agency in terms of disaster management.
So in the event of flooding, if you're deploying your men, what are their marching orders? What is their thinking?
In terms of flooding, for example, we always start with the early warning on all types of disasters. That is alert that something is imminent. This one, we work with the Ghana Meteorological Agency, who gives us daily forecasts of the weather situation and the imminence of a rainstorm or something. We are alerted. And then we share it through our system down to the communities on our social media platforms as well. And then our collaborators, we are all on one platform.
Right.
So we pre-position. because we know the flood-prone areas.
So the collaborators here will be
We have
Ghana
the-
National Fire Service, the police, the military,
Yeah.
ambulance service, Ghana Health
Yeah.
Service.
So the
Right.
National Ambulance Service are always on standby
Right.
to move in once casualties are recorded. But search and rescue will be done by NADMO rescue team, Ghana National Fire Service, Ghana Armed Forces,
Right.
with the police providing security,
Security.
and law and order.
Right, right.
So once we are able to receive distress calls, we look at the closest response team, and then it is directed for them to move in, and then they move in. If there's rescue, they rescue, and then if there are casualties, they are attended to by the ambulance service. If there are hospital situations, they are evacuated. If they are rescued and assessed and are in good condition, but then are displaced, then they are sent to the safe haven
Right.
to be taken care of. Then when the situation is normalized, then those in safe havens can move back to their homes.
Very well. So how do you identify flood-prone areas? What are some of the factors that contribute, or what is the criteria for a place to be declared a flood-prone area?
The topography is one. We also look at the history.
Okay.
The history of the area. It's always very important to look at the history of the area. What has been the flood situation in the area over a certain period of time. Then you know that it is likely to be flooded. Then you also look at the topography, realize that it is
Low-lying.
downstream, low line, below sea level, below flood levels. Then you know that it's a flood prone area. So these two things combine to tell us that these are flood prone areas. And then also the nature of development.
Right.
The nature of development in the area, the absence of drainage facilities. Because, you know, we have, let me talk about the types of flooding. We have the pluvial, that is the flash floods. Like what happened recently was a pluvial flood, flash floods. Heavy, high intensity rainfall, but low infiltration.
Okay. That means it doesn't seep into the ground.
Yes. Or it doesn't find its way to flow out.
Right.
So it stays for some time, and then, but in no time it recedes, and then things can get back to normal. And then we also have the fluvial, where the rivers overflow their banks and then flood communities. Yeah. So these are the two types. And then sometimes the two will combine. Because as it's raining heavily, not finding ways to infiltrate, the rivers will also overflow. Like on the 18th, some of the channels were overflowing.
Right.
And then infiltration was also very low. Looking at the amount of rainfall that was recorded, it means infiltration was very, very low. So post that incident, our technical teams are assessing the situation and making recommendations for appropriate action to be taken.
In your assessments, I'm sure you've identified these flood-prone areas. Can you give us a cursory idea, overview of what some of these areas are?
You see, Accra, like you've already said, January is a low-lying area and then it's a flat plain. And so, apart from the few hilly settlements, everywhere can be
Accra is
flooded.
at risk.
Yes, it's at risk.
And this can be
Depending
worsened by
on the
human activity.
capacity we build
Right.
in terms of drainage and the type of construction we do in those areas, then it can mitigate the flood.
Are we able to put a figure to the areas? Are we able to put a figure, say, maybe we've identified 10 actual flood-prone areas, say, in Greater Accra. We have, say, 15 in Eastern region. Do we have that?
At the Greater Accra metropolitan area is flood-prone.
Wow.
Yes. Because it sits right in front of the range. So a lot of flows down, low infiltration. That's what I've said. The few hilly parts of the capital are safe from floods. But every other part, low-lying part of the capital can be flooded, depending on the type of systems we put in place in terms of drains. That is how we build the capacity to withstand floods. Is what can save the areas.
Wow. Wager Dam is currently being spilled.
Yeah, yeah, well.
What has been a level of engagement? I mean, I am a bit worried that we are spilling just around the time that we are entering the rainy season itself, knowing the history of flooding anytime we spill.
You see, spilling itself is not a bad idea. There are two sides to spilling. We have the upstream and the downstream.
Right.
If you don't spill, two things happen. Upstream suffers,
Right.
and the dam itself is in danger.
Exactly. Yeah.
If you don't spill.
Yeah.
If you spill, you ease the pressures on upstream and the dam. And depending on how you spill, downstream may suffer. But then, so in spilling, we make sure that, you have to make sure that the channels are free.
Right.
We also make sure that, because the downstream always leads to the estuary, where the spilled water will enter the sea, and therefore the communities will be safe. But then the wager situation, sometimes the downstream floods heavily because the estuary blocks
Right.
from time to time.
Right.
And we need to open it up for the water to flow. And once we open up the estuary, there is free flow of water, and then the flooding in downstream is mitigated. So Wager Dam is now spilling. It's controlled spillage.
Right.
They are spilling 2 gates
Okay.
at 6 inches, which is controlled. So there's not too much water
Okay.
spilling downstream. But then it is also easing the pressure
Upstream.
Upstream areas like Ga West, Afuama, and then Ashalaja, in Sawom. Because, you know, there's a treatment
Yeah.
plant in
Yeah.
Sawom.
Yeah.
So it flows from there. So if Wager is spilling, then it means there's a lot of water from there.
And if we don't spill here,
Yeah.
there's a possibility of that side getting
Yeah.
flooded.
So upstream has to be relieved. And as you relieve upstream, you have to control it so that it doesn't burden downstream. So that is why we have the estuary, Wiaboma estuary, which is currently receiving
Okay.
all the spills into the sea. And then if it becomes too much,
Yeah.
then we are forced to open up a second estuary physically using machines, cutting the sea sand bed for the water to flow into the sea to protect downstream citizens.
Do we have man-made retention areas in Accra, or even in the country?
Not that I know of.
By how important
But then,
is it to have such?
yeah, retention areas are important because they will hold a lot of water. Water that will ordinarily flood communities will
Be retained in these
retain
areas
in
and
those
can
areas
even be used for
and
irrigation.
can be
in
used
some
for
way.
other purposes. Yeah.
Very well.
That is why we have the technical agencies who have the mandate to do all those things, and we are only monitoring the situation.
Right. Well, we're just about wrapping up, but let's look at what just happened. I'm sure by now you've done your mop-ups, you've done your post assessments and all that. What does it say? Your post assessment.
Like I said, the
Do you have
assessment.
an idea? We've been told that some 4 lives were lost, about 3,000
yeah.
displaced and all.
Yeah, and let me also take this opportunity and on behalf of my Director General, Major Retired Dr. Kuyon, offer our condolences to bereaved families.
Right.
In fact, our records indicate that 5 lives were lost.
5.
3 in the Ga East Municipality and 2 in Adenta Municipality. It's so unfortunate. But then it also tells us that we need to intensify our education because some of the deaths could have been avoided. The deaths could have been avoided but due to maybe a lack of understanding of a few things. So we need to intensify education in our communities and then also advise citizens to listen to weather warning information, weather information. Yeah, it's good to watch movies on TV and stuff like that. But when there's a weather information, just pause and then listen to those things because it's in our own interest that we know the situation. And then also, sometimes people think that they know the terrain so well. I know where the road is, so despite the floods, I won't miss my way. It's not about missing a way, it's about the currents, the undercurrents. It can sweep you away. That is why we have officers who are trained on how to walk through these flood waters to rescue and save people. Even for them, sometimes it's difficult, and then they will have to retreat because the life of their responder is our priority. The life or the safety of a responder is priority, because if he's alive and well, he can save so many people.
Yeah.
When we lose him, then all the people he could have saved most likely will be lost. So yes, people must understand. Yeah. And then sometimes, you know, we have what we call shelter in place. Sometimes you are better off staying put where you are. Even though there's flooding all around you, you are better off in your house, staying indoors.
Right.
And then when you call for help, then trained people will come and then get you out. But some people think that it's flooded all over the area. It may affect me where I am, so let me move out. And then you move out and walk through the floods, and then it sweeps you, and then it becomes. So sometimes you need to stay put wherever you are and just call for. That's why we put out the hotlines.
Can we put a number?
112, that is the National Emergency Hotline.
Right.
Or you call NADMO direct 0299 350 030. We will come and get you. On the 18th, several calls came. We went out there to get them.
Right.
So call and we'll come and get you.
Right. Mr. Moyate, thank you so much. This has been good. Hopefully we'll find time to engage more on NADMO, its work, and of course, disaster management and prevention in the country. Thank you so much.
And then thank you. And then finally, let me just greet all the NADMO, the Director General, the Deputy Director Generals, staff, management and staff of NADMO,
Right.
Ghana Armed Forces, Ghana National Fire
Fire
Service,
Service.
National Ambulance, and all our stakeholders who worked hand in hand with us to save lives on the 18th of when we experienced the floods.
Very well. Thank you so much, sir. Richard Amoyate, Director of Inspectorate, National Disaster Management Organization, helping us with some education regarding prevention, mitigation, and management of disaster in the country.